The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 15, verses 29 to 39. And Jesus departed from thence, and came nigh unto the sea of Galilee, and went up into a mountain, and sat down there. And great multitudes came unto him, having with them those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. Insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, the lame to walk, and the blind to see. And they glorified the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples unto him, and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in the way. And his disciples say unto him, Whence should we have so much bread in the wilderness, as to fill so great a multitude? And Jesus saith unto them, How many loaves have ye? And they said, 7, and a few little fishes. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and the fishes, and gave thanks, and brake them, and gave to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat, and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets full. And they that did eat were 4,000 men, beside women and children. And he sent away the multitude, and took ship, and came into the coasts of Magdala. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this final reading from chapter 15 of Matthew, we have another miracle of a feeding of a multitude in the wilderness. This time 4,000 men, whereas in the previous feeding of a multitude it was 5,000 men. Now, there are a number of commentators and scholars who think that this is actually just a different narration of the same event, but for various reasons I think it's fairly clear that in fact these are 2 separate events. I spoke about this in some detail when we went through this passage in the Gospel of Mark at the beginning of chapter 8 of Mark. The primary reason to believe that these are 2 separate events is that later on in the Gospel Jesus actually explicitly mentions the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 when he's speaking to the disciples, and I think that already just draws a line under the question. Another reason, though, to think of this as a separate event is to understand that this is taking place in a different region. The feeding of the 5,000 was not too far from Capernaum, to a mainly Jewish multitude. There's reason to believe that in this feeding of the 4,000 it was much more of a mixed multitude of both Jews and Gentiles. In the last reading from chapter 15 we saw that Jesus was in the border region of Galilee bordering on Tyre and Sidon, and that a Gentile woman, a Phoenician lady, came to him, and she was a Gentile, but begged for the crumbs from the table of the Jewish master, as it were. And in coming back down to the Sea of Galilee, in Mark we have reason to believe that this is in the region of Decapolis, so it would be on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, which would have had a higher Gentile population. That understanding of the mixed multitude in this second miracle feeding explains a lot of the questions, as we'll see. So Jesus and his disciples then have come down from the border regions of Tyre and Sidon, close to the Sea of Galilee. He's in a mountain, so this would be maybe in the range that includes Mount Hermon, and to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Great multitudes come to him, and we're quite explicit here in Matthew on the nature of their maladies. Lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and then many others. It is curious how Mark will almost always mention unclean spirits alongside physical ailment. In modern language, modern parlance, the mental and physical illness together, whereas Matthew seems to concentrate more on the physical ailments, mentioning far less often the unclean spirits or the mental ailments. And we learn that they cast them down at Jesus' feet, and this is in the sense of in a hurry rather than violently, because I presume there'd be so many people seeking to be healed that the people bringing them had to be quick. They may be probably not a queue, but there would be, a mob of people around Jesus, the disciples probably in that region around Jesus, trying to keep some kind of order. But yes, everything would have been done quite rapidly, I think. And we learn that he healed them. And the multitude wondered and glorified the God of Israel. And because they glorified the God of Israel rather than just God, that would indicate to me that they were not all Jewish. They would know of the God of Israel, of course, having lived side by side with the Jewish people for many, many, many centuries. And here is this great prophet from Nazareth, great sort of emerging Jewish leader with his Jewish disciples, doing these miracles of healing. Of course, they're going to glorify the God of Israel. And we're told that the dumb were able to speak, the lame to walk, the blind to see, and in particular the maimed to be whole. And some commentators here wonder whether this may have been actually people missing limbs, because to be maimed usually means that something is missing in an accident. To be made whole would imply that perhaps someone who's missing a hand or a foot was actually made whole. And indeed, that's a visual miracle that would have a profound effect on people to see that. If you make a blind person to see, it is extraordinary to be a witness of that, but you don't see much happening. Whereas if you see the regeneration of a hand or a foot or a limb, of course, that's the stuff of dreams, and the multitude would indeed wonder and glorify this foreign god, as it were. Now, we learn that this has been going on for 3 days, presumably with teaching alongside, and the people have run out of their provisions that they would have brought with them, probably only bringing enough for 1 or 2 meals. Bear in mind that with the Jewish counting of days, any part of a day counts as a day, so this may have really only been, say, an afternoon, a full day, and then the third day maybe is halfway through. So not 3 nights, as it were, but essentially a time span of, say, 48 hours, including 2 nights, would count as 3 days. The multitude has nothing to eat. He doesn't want to send them away unless they faint, and that's not a trivial thing. If someone were to faint from hunger on the way home in the wilderness, they may not ever make it home because of no one being there to help them, no emergency services in those days, particularly in these less settled areas. Not to mention wild animals would happily prey on a person who was incapacitated. Now the disciples say to him, "Where would we get so much bread in the wilderness as to feed a great multitude?" And when you first read this, you can't believe how obtuse the disciples are being, because they have witnessed the feeding of the 5,000, in only weeks previous. An extraordinary miracle. And this is one of the reasons why some commentators think that the feeding of the 4,000 is just the same event, because why else would the disciples be so slow to catch on? But that doesn't make sense to use this as a pivot to think that these are the same event, because why would the writers of Mark and Matthew include both? And if they did include both, knowing they were one event, why would they include this nonsensical statement from the disciples? So I think it's much more natural to think of this as a second feeding of the multitude, and then to ask the question, why are the disciples asking Jesus about the origin of food in the wilderness? And a reason that the commentators give, which I think is interesting, is that they've only seen Jesus perform that once. Now, they have been hungry with Jesus in the past, when we saw the disciples actually eating from kernels of wheat in a wheat field out of hunger. Jesus wasn't just creating bread for them, so they're used to being in need around Jesus. He's not a divine bread maker. They've only seen this once. It would be more natural perhaps for them to assume that that was a one-off event, or Jesus required some other agency that is not available most of the time. So that's one view of the commentators. I think another view that I've not seen written down is that if this was more of a mixed multitude of Gentiles and Jews, the disciples may just naturally assume that Jesus would not perform a miracle on that scale for the Gentiles, just as he was reluctant to perform a miracle of healing for the Syrophoenician woman. So these are possible explanations for this, otherwise rather difficult to understand reaction. But their pondering is soon laid to rest, as Jesus says to them, "How many loaves have ye?" And they say 7 and a few little fishes. He commands the multitude to sit. In Mark, we understand that they are seated. I thought in Mark that they were seated in 50s and 100s, but I'm looking at Mark here, and that's not the case. But we can assume that probably he had them sit in groups. I think one reason that we saw in the earlier feeding they were sat in groups of 50 and 100 was actually it made it easier to distribute the food fairly. If it's just everyone together, you don't know if everyone's had an equal share of the food, but if it's in groups of 50, of course, you can share the food out very fairly. And also count the number of people. How did they know there were 5,000 or 4,000? Well, if they're sitting in groups of 50 or 100, then of course you can immediately count approximately the number. And Jesus blesses the food and breaks the bread, gives to his disciples, and everyone eats and is filled. And they take up of the fragments 7 baskets full. A tiny point here from the Greek translation that I've learned from some of the translation experts who commentate, which is that the baskets referred to in the feeding of the 5,000 were hand baskets, whereas the baskets that are referred to in the feeding of the 4,000 were more like hampers. So these 7 baskets full as hampers may have been actually more fragments than when we learned of the 12 hand baskets full of fragments. The numbers are interesting. I mentioned in this commentary on the Mark parallel reading, perhaps 7 baskets here, 7 hampers for the 1 for each loaf, whereas there were 12 baskets before, 1 for each disciple. These numbers are intriguing, but we should not look too deeply at them. And all 4,000 men beside women and children. Once everyone is nourished for their journey home and healed, one can only imagine the atmosphere of that multitude. The gospel taking very, very firm hold for the people who were present at these miracles of feeding. They are sent to their homes, and Jesus and his disciples take a ship to the coasts of Magdala. there's quite a lot of discussion where exactly this is. In Mark, it says into the parts of Dalmanutha, which is a place that no longer exists. People think it's in the same vicinity as Magdala. There was a Magdala close to Capernaum, but people think there may have also been a Magdala on the east coast of the Sea of Galilee. I think my assumption here would be that it's close to Capernaum, only because when Jesus and the disciples arrive, they are met by Pharisees, so implying a strongly Jewish area, which would be more on the west coast. And this rounds out chapter 15 of Matthew, and as we begin a new adventure tomorrow with chapter 16 and the following chapters in Matthew, we will be the beneficiaries of much teaching from Jesus, but also, of course, the mounting tensions between Jesus and the Pharisees as he begins to wend his way to his end in Jerusalem, his end in his earthly form, and the beginning, though, of the spiritual miracle of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.